Today, I will be sort of doing an addendum to the last time I spoke, which was about the importance of independent thinking. Now, the reason why that is important is because without independent thinking, there would never have been a Christian church. This is what people don't realize. And many of these scientific advancements that we have come to discover and that have allowed us to progress as a species would never have come to pass without independent thinking. You must remember, prior to Galileo teaching us that the universe, excuse me, revolved around the sun, we believed in something called geocentricity, which means we believed that the entire universe revolved around the earth. And of course, he was persecuted terribly by the Catholic Church for that, but we soon came to discover that he was right and everyone else was wrong. So the majority of people who believe in something has nothing to do or has no bearing on the truthfulness of that particular piece of information. So independent thinking is absolutely critical for us to continue progressing as people, as humanity, and it is absolutely critical for us to be able to determine and discover the truth. So I hope this makes sense today. We're going to be talking about this in light of the fact that, when you have independent thinkers, you will always have people who will have different opinions. And the problem that we have today in society and in the church is that you have many people who no longer know how to disagree in love. The concept of having a civil dialogue and a civil disagreement is almost become a foreign thing. The concept of being able to sit down and have a conversation and an exchange of ideas with two people who aren't on the same page has almost become something that is null and void. And it's because we are taught that if the other person doesn't share the same belief, it's because they are wrong, they are evil, they are on the wrong side of history, and they must be dealt with. And this is very, very dangerous thinking. And we're going to look at some of these things. So, one of the first things I want to share with you, there is a man by the name of George R. Martin. And George R. Martin, he had a very popular book series called Game of Thrones. I've never actually seen this for a number of reasons, but he had a very popular book series called Game of Thrones. And as I was doing research one day, I came upon a quote that I believe came out of the book or the series or something to that effect. But wherever it came from, it was incredibly powerful. And here's what it says. It says, when you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You are only telling the world that you fear what he might say. Let me say that one more time. When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You are only telling the world that you fear what he might say. So when you look at some of these reactions that we see to people who have different opinions or who are independent thinkers, who are unwilling to just blindly follow the worldview or the official story or whatever the crowd chooses to believe, when we look at some of the reactions toward these people, we can see that we are heading into dangerous times. And why would somebody fear what an independent thinker might say? You see, here's the thing. One of the things that we have to understand is that truth can always stand up under investigation. Did you hear what I said? Truth can always stand up under investigation, but a lie, an untruth, a half truth, propaganda, things that are meant to mislead people will melt under scrutiny. And so, if you are lying or propagandizing a group of people, you have to immediately silence anybody who might be trying to shine a light on what you're saying, because you might lose your power and control over this particular group of people that you're trying to deceive. Now, I'm going to go back to an example that some of you all might know, and it's found in the book of Luke, chapter 4. This is a very familiar passage for some, but this is in the book of Luke, chapter 4, and it is it's very interesting very interesting when we look at what happened here. This is a story about Christ, about Jesus Christ, and he goes to his old hometown of Nazareth, and this is what he says. Luke chapter 4, verse 16 tells us this story. It says, "And he, being Jesus, came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his customs were, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." And he closed the book and he gave it to the minister and he sat down. And the eyes of all them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say to them, "This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." So, in that particular moment, Jesus walked into the synagogue in his own hometown and he grabbed the scroll of Isaiah and he went right to the place where it talks about the Messiah and the mission of the Messiah and his purpose and what he was going to accomplish. And when he read it with such power and such conviction that it moved the hearts of the people that were there. And something said, "Is he the Messiah?" And he knew the question that the people were wondering as he read that. And he said, to dispel all doubt, he said, This day, this day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears." Now, what was the problem with that? Well, the powers that be, the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of the Jewish nation, the political leaders of the Jewish nation, the Pharisees were, for all intents and purposes, the mainstream media of the Jewish nation. Whatever they said was truth and it was not to be questioned. And what they taught was they taught that when the Messiah came, he was going to be a conquering Messiah and he was going to break the yoke of the Roman power and deliver the world and the empire of the world into the hands of the Jewish nation, and they were going to rule all people and have riches beyond their wildest imaginations. This is what they taught. And here is Jesus, a poor itinerant preacher who grew up in Nazareth, which was, for all intents and purposes, the hood. And he's over here talking about, yo, today, right now, I'm telling you, I'm the guy, I'm the Messiah. Okay. And what happened? Well, he said something that they didn't like. He said something that went against the official story and what they had been taught. And how did they react? It says, and all bear him witness and wondered at the gracious words that proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" Right? What are they talking? What is he talking about? I'm the Messiah. I mean, he's that same little old boy that grew up down the street working in his father's carpenter shop. And he's poor and he's broke and he has nothing. He's homeless, as a matter of fact. See, he didn't fit the bill. And what happened? It says, and he said unto them, "You will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. Whosoever we have heard, or whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in thy country." And he said, "Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. But I tell you of a truth, many widows were in Israel in the days of Elias, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, when the great famine was throughout all the land. But unto none of them was Elias sent, save unto Sarepta, a city of Sidon, unto a woman that was a widow. And many lepers were in Israel at the time of Eliseus the prophet, and none of them was cleansed, save Naaman the Syrian." Oh, I don't know if you realize what Jesus just did here. You see, Jesus just gave an example of, two, not one, but two Gentiles that were blessed rather than the children of Israel. And I don't know if you realize this, but in those days and in that part of the world, in the Jewish nation, those were fighting words. And it says, and all they in the synagogue, when they had heard these things, were filled with wrath. So Jesus said something that they didn't like. Here's the question: was it true? Absolutely. It was absolutely true. Jesus said something that was true. They just didn't like it. And you know what they were ready to do? They were ready to kill the messenger, not just figuratively, literally, because look at what it says. It says they were filled with wrath and rose up and thrust him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill whereupon the city was built, that they might cast him headlong, down headlong over that cliff. Can you believe that? These people were ready to literally kill the messenger. They were ready to literally murder Jesus simply because he said something that they didn't like. When you tear out a man's tongue, you're not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say. Now, we see this, and for those of us who are of the Christian persuasion, and for those of us who are churchgoers, we say, well, I would never do that. Absolutely not. That's terrible, that's horrible. But you know what? I am seeing, not just in the world, but I am seeing in the church those very same behaviors happening. Now, in the church, you have not just members, but you have high ranking church officers, you have pastors who are now attacking other people and telling them that if you don't go along with the official story, that if you don't believe the government narrative, that if you question things, you are wrong and you are evil. There's no middle ground, there's no gray area, there's only black or white. And that's a complete logical fallacy, that there's only you're here or you're there, right? It's happening, and we where does this start? It started in the world, and we claim to be better than the world, but we act just like the world, so it doesn't make any sense. But here is what here's an example. Some of you might be familiar with this. A few years ago, there was a man named Alex Jones. Okay, now I am not a huge fan of this person. um I've heard things from this person, and he's very loud, bombastic, very sensational, very over the top, and it's just not my cup of tea. However, I do believe that he, just like every other American citizen, has the right to share his thoughts and his beliefs, however disagreeable they may be. And yes, he does it in a way that's not exactly palatable for someone like myself. But hey, there might be some people who want to hear what he has to say. Well, this man was a few years ago deplatformed from every major social media site, from Facebook, from Twitter, from Instagram, you name it. He was deplatformed in a coordinated effort and pulled off of these platforms, and even his Infowars app was taken down from the app store. So they were trying to make it almost impossible for this man to get his message out. Now, some people were cheering, and some people were saying, absolutely, I disagree with Alex Jones. I disagree with the way that he says things, and he is dangerous, and this is a good thing. Some people were saying, well, they're private companies, so they have the right to do whatever they want. Well, here's an article. This is an opinion piece from the USA Today, which is a mainstream news media outlet. And here's what it says. This is from August 8th, 2018. And the title of the article is Booting Alex Jones from Social Media Wasn't Wrong, but It Could Be Dangerous. Now, this is 3 years ago, mind you, a little bit over 3 years ago at this point. It says, but what if Jones was subjected to more radical deplatforming? And what if it was the start of a slippery slope? At least one politician, Representative Chris Murphy, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, seems to advocate exactly that, tweeting that Infowars is the tip of a giant iceberg of hate and lies, and that sites like Facebook and YouTube must do more than take down one website. When calls for internet companies to restrict objectionable speech turn into political pressure, it should be worrying even to those who shed no tears for Jones. Here are the basic justifications for deplatforming Jones. Another cause for concern is While Jones is widely despised for peddling conspiratorial smears, for instance, that the Sandy Hook school shooting was a hoax and that the parents of the murdered children were crisis actors, or that Hillary Clinton and her top advisors ran a child sex trafficking ring out of Washington, a Washington, D.C. pizza restaurant. The stated reasons for his ban is on his content is not defamation, but quote unquote hate speech against Muslims, transgender people, and other groups. You see, what they did was they found a way to take his speech and label it as hate speech, or some sort of speech against a certain group, and that was how they were able to justify removing him from these platforms. And people cheered for this because he's sort of an extreme, bombastic, obnoxious personality. But if you look at what Representative Chris Murphy was advocating for, he was advocating for not just him, but other people, that these social media companies have to do more than just take down one site. And my question is, did they do that? What has happened since they deplatformed Alex Jones? They started deplatforming one person after another. Anybody who dared to share thoughts that were not in line with the official story or the powers that be was now removed. Okay? And ironically, a lot of the people that were deplatformed for saying certain things, we find out a year later were absolutely right. So if anything, we should be apologizing to these people that were deplatformed for saying something that was labeled a conspiracy theory, but was absolutely right. And we'll come back to that word conspiracy theory in just a minute. I want to read something from you. This is actually from Stanford has a website where they put information that they share in classes, and this was from a lecture called Capitalist versus Communist Theory on Speech and Press Freedoms. Now listen to this. It says, communism as a primarily economic system is much quieter on the issue of individual human rights. Two conflicting positions on these freedoms arise with analysis of communist theory. The first argument is an argument against individual freedoms. In a communist society, the individual's best interests are indistinguishable from the society's best interests. Thus, the idea of an individual freedom is incompatible with a communist ideology. The only reason to hold individual speech and information rights would be to better the society, a condition which would likely be met only in certain instances rather than across time, making the default lack of freedom. So here's what they're saying. The only time that you have the right to express yourself is when it is for the betterment of society and when that idea goes along with what the powers that be say is good and right. So if the powers that be, the rulers of society, say something that is good and right, you can say that. But if it's not, if your idea, your thought is something that conflicts with what they say, then you can't say that. So really, that's not freedom at all, because you're only allowed to parrot government propaganda, to cover mainstream media ideologies, to cover the official approved thought, right? Now, when you look at the censorship that is happening in this country, you're now seeing things that are very much mimicking or mirroring things that were happening in communist societies. 50 years ago, it would have been unacceptable to think that we could start censoring people indiscriminately for simply having disagreeable opinions. But now people are cheering it, advocating for it, and asking for more of it. So that should tell you where we are as a society, and we're in a very dangerous place. Going back to Christ, you look at the Pharisees and the way that they talked about Jesus. They told lies, they discredited him, they attacked him, and eventually they killed him. You see, when you tear out a man's tongue, you're not proving him to be a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say, because what Jesus was saying was that the Pharisees are hypocrites. What they're teaching you is wrong. And I've come to give you truth, to set you free. You've been enslaved by lies, by fear, and I've come to give you a truth that will break the bonds of lies. And they didn't like that because they didn't want to lose their power. Think about this. If Jesus were alive today, what would the web say about him? What would the mainstream media say about him? What would the government politicians say about him? And the government politicians are the equivalent of the Pharisees. What would they say about him? Probably not too many good things. Now, going back to the term conspiracy theory, we hear this term conspiracy theory a lot. What people don't realize is that the term conspiracy theory is, you ever see those hypnotists, and they put somebody under hypnosis, and they'll use a word, and as soon as they say this word, because they've hypnotized somebody, this person will fall asleep, or they'll start barking like a dog, or they'll start acting like a baby, or something, whatever it is. But they say one word, and a person has an involuntary psychological reaction to that one word, and they start acting completely different. Well, what happens when you call something a conspiracy theory? What happens when you call somebody a conspiracy theorist? Well, as soon as you say that's conspiracy theory, immediately, boom, what does that do? It psychologically triggers somebody's mind to shut down and to close off against that particular piece of information. When you label somebody a conspiracy theorist, immediately you start looking at that person as somebody who lacks credibility, who is crazy, or maybe even dangerous. You see, if Jesus were alive today, they would have labeled him a conspiracy theorist. Now, where does the term conspiracy theory come from, and why was that term invented, and why was it used for this purpose? Well, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, who was a former assistant secretary of the US Treasury and former editor of the Wall Street Journal, says this. He says, the term conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA in order to prevent disbelief of official government stories. Did you hear that? Let me say that again. The term conspiracy theory was invented by the CIA in order to prevent disbelief of official government stories. It was a pejorative term that was to be attached to anything that did not coincide with the official story or was not favorable to the narrative that was being propagated by the powers that be. You call it conspiracy theory and you attack it. That's what they were taught. Here it says, Ron Unz reports on the cold shoulder given to an extensively researched book that concludes that World War II hero General George Patton was murdered by the CIA because he became a powerful critic of Washington. The book was ignored because the US media and public have been programmed to regard the US government as a truth teller, and those who expose the government as government crimes as conspiracy theorists, quote unquote. In 2013, Professor Lance DeHaven Smith, in a peer-reviewed book published by the University of Texas Press, showed that the term conspiracy theory was developed by the CIA as a means of undercutting critics of the Warren Commission report that President Kennedy was killed by Oswald. The use of this term was heavily promoted in the media by the CIA. It is ironic that the American left is a major enforcer of the CIA's strategy to shut up skeptics by branding them as conspiracy theorists. Let me say this one more time. It is ironic that the American left, in other words, the liberals, the ones who are liberal, freedom, like those are supposed to be synonyms, right? Says the American left is the major enforcer of the CIA strategy to shut up skeptics by branding them as conspiracy theorists. So quite the contrary, they're not being liberal at all. They're actually advocating censorship. They're advocating a lack of freedom of expression, which is exactly what happens in communist societies. You kill the messenger. Now, you might say, well, okay, that's very interesting, but what does this have to do with, you know, people who are in the church? Why does this have any place, in a discussion that is in any way related to a church ministry? We're going to have to come to grips with the fact that this nonsense that I'm sharing with you is is in the church already. It's not coming into the church, it is in the church. And it is being preached from pulpits all across the world. You have pastors who are watching the Communist News Network, CNN. You have pastors who are watching CNN and coming into the pulpit and preaching nonsense that is nothing more than a baptized version of CNN. They are propagating the same things, the same ideologies. It's absolutely insane. And you say, I don't believe that. You're being an accuser of the brethren. I'm not saying, I'm not naming names. I'm not saying I believe this person is on the take and I believe that person is working for the CIA. I believe this, or I believe that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that some of these people may unknowingly be influenced by these propagandists and then coming and misleading their flocks unknowingly. And there may be some who do it knowingly. And you say, do you have any proof of that? And I say, absolutely, because I come with the receipts. The Select Committee on Intelligence of the United States of America in the 114th Fourth Congress, second session, on July 17th, 1996, Wednesday, held a hearing called, listen, the CIA's use of journalists and clergy in intelligence operations. You didn't hear me. Let me say that again. The CIA's use of journalists and clergy in intelligence operations. Now, some of you have a problem. You fall in love with these media personalities, right? Why do you think everyone who comes on TV is good looking, articulate, charming, right? Well, you can't let no regular folks get on TV and do the news. No, everybody's got to be good looking. As a matter of fact, in other countries, they make fun of the United States and they call the women reporters that look like Barbie dolls. They call them news models or something like that. And the reason why is because it doesn't really have as much to do with their talent as it does their looks. Why? Because psychologically, your guard comes down when you see these good looking, charming, articulate journalists, and we start falling in love with their personalities, and then we start believing what they say, and we're more likely to believe it. So if you were a group, an intelligence group, and you were hell-bent on propagandizing a certain group of people, you would make sure that you had some good-looking, charming journalists, and that's what you see. And when you look at clergy, here's the problem. See, we have too many people in churches that are following pastors and not following God. And that is why when a pastor loses his mind and decides that he wants to start preaching some crazy unbiblical nonsense, and then they go and leave the church, you see all these people follow that pastor because they're following a pastor and not Jesus. Okay. So the CIA understands the power of journalists and clergy, and that's why they have this report in the Select Committee on Intelligence of the United States 104th Congress session called the CIA's use of journalists and clergy in intelligence operations. So please don't tell me that that's not possible. Now, we have a very big issue that's going on today, not just in the world, but in churches, and it's the issue of COVID-19. And you would think that in churches, we would know how to handle this issue. And of all places, you would think that in churches, we would believe in freedom more than anywhere else, And don't tell me that God doesn't believe in freedom, because even the law of God is referred to in the book of James, chapter 2, as the law of liberty. Did you catch that? It's referred to as the law of liberty. And the reason why was that the law of God was not about restricting or restraining. The law of God was about providing a safe universe for the inhabitants to live in, to have peace and joy and happiness. The law of God was about love, about respecting each other, respecting God. The law of God was about showing love to God and to our fellow mankind and other inhabitants of the universe. That's what the law of God was about. It was not meant to restrict or restrain. It was meant to provide liberty, right? If everybody, drove around the streets 100 miles an hour, not stopping at red lights and stop signs and things like that, nobody would feel safe to go walk around the neighborhood with their children or their dogs or anything like that. You would be a prisoner in your own home. So the fact that we have some laws just giving guidance and governing the way things should go is not a restriction or a restraint necessarily. It's about providing a safe place for people. And that's why James calls it that. So don't tell me that God is an advocate of any of this nonsense. But what you have the issue of COVID-19, and you have some pastors that are pushing people on the subject of vaccines. That's an individual choice. It should always be an individual choice. A pastor or a clergyman should have no business telling people what to do with their health. Okay? Um, I don't care what anybody says. And yet you have pastors that are attacking, that are speaking condescendingly towards people who maybe have some skepticism or some questions or some issues with certain things. Um, and then these pastors will go out of their way to try and find any obscure little example to justify the government creating mandates, trying to force people to get vaccinated or anything like that. It's bizarre. These pastors, supposed to be men of God, are sitting here trying to justify the government removing our personal freedoms. And then they're sitting up in their pulpits attacking people who are making the choice to not get vaccinated. As a matter of fact, there is one very prominent pastor, I won't name names, but he had a panel. And at the beginning of the panel, they said, we wanted to have a fair and balanced panel to discuss the issue of vaccines. And they brought on 5 people, I believe, on this panel who were all doctors. And every single last one of them was extreme pro-vaccine, and they began to attack anybody who didn't believe their dogma. As a matter of fact, one of the most arrogant and most pompous of these doctors, who was also, I believe, a pastor of some sort, he sat up there and he said, the problem is that we have a bunch of YouTube scholars. So basically, what he's saying is, you're not educated like me, you're beneath me, and you watch a couple of YouTube videos and think you know everything. What you need to do is sit down, shut up, and listen to me because I am the authority. Well, you know what? That sounds a lot like a man by the name of Anthony Fauci who said, if you attack me, you're really attacking science because I am the science. Very interesting. Kind of reminds me of when Jesus said, I am the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. But the problem is that Jesus was the truth. So that was okay for Jesus to say that. Jesus was trying to say, the truth shall make you free, and I am the truth. What Fauci is saying is he's saying science shall make you free. If you just listen to us, you'll be safe and everything will go back to normal. And I am the science. In other words, he's saying, I am your savior. Okay? But if you disbelieve that, you're a YouTube scholar, is what they said. They sat on this panel and attacked people for daring to question the official narrative. It was bizarre. Um, and this same individual later on gave a sermon where he compared people who questioned the government narrative, who questioned the government as conspiracy theorists, and he compared them to Satan questioning God before the fall. Did you catch that? How dare you question the government? If you do that, you are just like Satan before the fall. Isn't that something crazy? Now, why are you doing this? Why? Because that's a way, an attempt to try and shut people up, to get people to stop questioning the truth. When you tear out a man's tongue, you're not proving him to be a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say. Censorship is no place in the church. Yeah, obviously there's certain things that we don't say in church. out of respect for God and His house. But if you're trying to shut down people who have different opinions simply because they don't agree with you, that's not right. And I'll give you an example. This same individual, around the time where all of these race relation issues started heating up over the last 4 or 5 years, began giving sermons where he was essentially calling out white church members who weren't going along with Black Lives Matter and things like that racist, simply because if you disagree, it's because you're racist. And that's not really the spirit of Christ. See, that's what the world does. See, in the world, if you disagree with the world, you're a racist, bigot, homophobe, transphobe. You're all sorts of isms and ist, right? And that's what they do. They try to attack you. And many of you might be sitting up here listening to me thinking, "Oh, he's a right-wing conservative." And if you do, you might have a problem with some blind spots and might have some unrealized bigotry. Because what I'm doing is I'm just sharing the truth. And I have been called that by many people simply by just sharing the truth. And it's very, very sad. Now, what they're doing is they are beginning to attack anybody who questions the vaccines. We have a man by the name of Dr. Robert Malone. Now, Dr. Robert Malone is the inventor of the mRNA technology. So the mRNA technology that is being used in these COVID vaccines, he invented the technology. Okay? He invented the technology, but you know what's very interesting is he's going around and he's telling people to be very skeptical of the vaccines, that something's wrong. You might want to really do your research before you take these. And as a matter of fact, you might want to hold off on taking these. And certainly you might not want to give these to your children. And because he had a different opinion than the mainstream narrative, even though he was the inventor of the technology, Wikipedia actually removed him from their website as the creator of the technology. I wonder why. Maybe to take away some of his authority, because it's a problem when the inventor of the technology is saying, you better be careful because there's a problem with this. Let me read this to you. This is from LifeSite News. It says, information about the inventor of mRNA technology used in certain COVID-19 vaccines was removed from the online encyclopedia website Wikipedia after he publicly warned against giving the experimental gene therapy vaccines to young people, and that there was insufficient information about the injections to give informed consent. Dr. Robert Malone, MD, MS, discovered RNA transfection, and while he was at the Salk Institute in San Diego in 1988, invented mRNA vaccines. His research was continued the next year at Vicol, and between 1988 and 1989, Malone wrote the patent disclosures for mRNA vaccines. The man owned the patents. He invented the technology. On June 10th, 2021, Dr. Malone joined biologist Brett Weinstein, PhD, on Dark Horse podcast, where Malone raised numerous safety concerns about the Pfizer BioNTech and Moderna COVID-19 vaccines, both of which use mRNA technology. He warned about future autoimmune issues caused by the spike proteins within the mRNA injections. Malone also stated that the Food and Drug Administration was aware that the spike proteins were biologically active and could travel from the injection site and cause adverse reactions, and that the spike protein, if biologically active, is very dangerous. What happened? YouTube swiftly moved to censor clips from the 3-hour podcast interview. And we know recently that he has been kicked off of Twitter. He recently did a podcast with a very famous commentator named Joe Rogan. And any clips of that were removed from YouTube. And as a matter of fact, what happens? Now they're attacking not just Robert Malone, but they're attacking Joe Rogan. Let's look at the article. Here's a Rolling Stone article, and it says, quote, "A menace to public health. Doctors demand that Spotify puts an end to COVID lies on Joe Rogan Experience." That's his podcast show. Unlike many health platforms, Spotify doesn't have a clear policy prohibiting misinformation. 270 physicians and scientists are hoping to change that. Listen to this. As an infectious disease epidemiologist and research fellow at Boston's Children's Hospital, who debunks health misinformation on Instagram, where she has more than 380,000 followers, Jessica Rivera regularly receives tips from her followers about viral content to debunk. A few weeks ago, her followers started sending her links to an episode of Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast in the world. The episode was an interview with Dr. Robert Malone, a virologist who touts himself as one of the architects of mRNA technology. Rivera was familiar with Rogan as well as Malone, and she knew that Malone had been banned from Twitter for promoting COVID misinformation. Did you see that? Listen to what it just said. It says the episode was an interview with Dr. Robert Malone, a virologist who touts himself as one of the architects of mRNA technology. So here we see how the mainstream media lies. The man owns the patents on mRNA technology, invented the technology, and they say a man who touts himself as one of the architects of the. So basically what they're insinuating is that he's lying. He didn't really do that. Then it goes on to say, Rivera was familiar with Malone. She knew that he had been banned from Twitter for promoting COVID-19 misinformation, and that he had been making the rounds in conservative media circles, undermining the efficacy of the vaccine. So do you see what they're doing here? They're saying, oh yeah, Dr. Robert Malone, he'd been banned from Twitter. That's called argumentum ad hominem, which means it's an ad hominem attack on his character. Oh, well, you shouldn't believe him because, well, he says he's the inventor of that or one of the architects, but not really. And he'd been banned for Twitter from, promoting misinformation. So that's why you don't want to believe in him. You got to look at these things and look between the lines, okay? And then it says that he had been making rounds in conservative media circles, undermining the efficacy of the vaccine. So now what they do is they attach what he's saying to conservative media circles and conservative media outlets, because if you're on the left, then of course you don't believe any of that stuff. So the only reason why it's now a political thing, right? And then they say he's undermining the efficacy of the vaccine. Well, here's the thing. We have now come to know that people who get the vaccine can still get COVID, can still spread COVID, and can still die from COVID. And we are now coming to know that there must be booster after booster in order to, have immunity indefinitely, is what they're saying. So what he was saying wasn't wrong, but do you see how they twist things? And why are they doing this? Why are they attacking him? They're attacking him because he's daring to say something that is contradictory to the official story, and it's a problem for the narrative. When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him wrong. You are only proving that you are afraid of what he might say. This is the problem with stopping people from sharing their opinions and trying to shut down any discourse that doesn't coincide with your own. Okay? When you look at Joe Rogan, what are they doing? They're attacking him left and right. CNN in particular is attacking him, telling lie after lie about this man. And it's funny because CNN's viewership is down over 90% from 1 year ago. Did you hear that? It's down 90% from over 1 year ago. One episode of the Joe Rogan podcast gets 11 million followers, while CNN in a day with all their programs combined gets about 800,000 viewers a day. Not even 1 million viewers a day. Joe Rogan has about 13 times more followers than CNN, or more listeners than CNN. It's really insane, and that's why they're attacking him. They're also attacking a man by the name of Dr. Peter McCullough. Now, Dr. Peter McCullough I just listened to an hour and a half talk from him last night. It was brilliant. I couldn't believe some of the information that he was sharing. It was fascinating. And you know what they're trying to do to Dr. Peter McCullough because he doesn't share thoughts or ideas that coincide with the official narrative? They are literally trying to remove his medical credentials and his medical license. They're trying to revoke it so that he can no longer practice medicine. As a matter of fact, any doctor that is prescribing ivermectin or anything that doesn't call, even though ivermectin is less dangerous than aspirin, they are trying to remove and revoke their medical licenses. Why are they doing this? Why are they acting so similar to communists and to people like Mao Zedong and Fidel Castro and Stalin, where you would throw anybody who disagreed with you in a gulag? When you look at Satan, anytime Satan was afraid of anything happening, information getting out, what did he do? He went on a murdering spree. When he thought the Messiah was coming at the time of Moses, he had all the babies under 2 years old killed. And when he knew that the Messiah was going to be born soon, at the time of Christ, he had all the babies under 2 years old killed. You see, when you are afraid of what might happen if the truth gets out, what you try to do is you try to silence the truth, which is what they're doing to Peter McCullough, to Dr. Robert Malone, the inventor of the mRNA technology, to Joe Rogan and people like him, and to any doctors or anyone who is sharing opinions or beliefs that don't coincide with the official narrative. They're trying to shut them up. And it's not just the mainstream media. It's not just the government. It's not just these political pundits out in the world. It's in the church now. It's happening in the church. And that should send chills up everybody's spine, because the church should be the protector of freedom and liberty. And, I've always said this. I may not agree with you, I may not support you or your lifestyle or whatever it is, but I will always support your right to make your own choice. And that is between you and God. But that's not what's happening. And so now, even in the church, pastors are being used to spread this nonsense. I don't believe that all of them are doing it knowingly. I believe that some of them have just been fooled themselves because they watch things like the Clown News Network. But I do believe that there are some who are not honest men. And that is why you have to keep your eyes focused on Jesus. Because Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and the truth shall make you free. When you see people who are not advocating truth and protecting freedom, you should raise an eye. You should raise an eyebrow, because something is wrong there. Because the Bible tells us in Isaiah 8:20, if they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. Now, you might be totally in favor of vaccines, and that's fine. I don't care. Like, this is not about that. My point is that when you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving them to be wrong or proving them a liar. You're only telling the world that you fear what he might say. Shutting down dissent is not the way to go, and it's certainly not the way that we should be doing things in churches. We should not be mimicking the world, because in church, we should be above that, and we should be able to have conversations even where we disagree, and disagree in love. So that's all I have for today. I hope that that we are at least in agreement that we should be protecting each other's abilities to have different thoughts and different ideas, because if everybody has the same thought and the same beliefs and is not allowed to believe anything else, that's not a church, it's a cult. So I hope you enjoyed that.